Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the official graveyard shift for this year's Avert conference. Thank you for sticking with us for the last 3 days, and to anyone that's abused caffeine to make it to this point, coffee companies around the world are eternally grateful for that commitment. So thanks for getting us this far. We actually have a really cool session, and I hope we've got enough left in the tank to stick with it. The session is titled Frames and Funnels, Recruitment, Gender and Media Reporting in Online Extremist Contexts. I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Christopher David from the University of Applied Sciences, New Ulm. How was that for pronunciation? Was all right? Not too bad? I'm almost half German. I'm good to go. Presentation titled, and for the record, there is some ancient Greek in this title, so work with me on this. It's a Goji or Paideia, comparing gatekeeping practices in online extremist forums. Please welcome Christopher.
Is this yours? No, this isn't yours. Did they upload it then?
Yeah, that's uploaded.
So it should be yeah. There you go. And as you open you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really glad to be here and to be presenting in front of the dedicated core that stayed till the very end. Today I will be presenting actually part of a larger research project that is focused on online collective learning in virtual extremist web forums. I will be zooming in, though, on gatekeeping practices within these spaces. I will be throwing around that word a lot. When I mean gatekeeping, I really mean any measure which is taken by established members within the community to kind of like decide upon acceptance or exclusion of newcomers coming into the community. We looked at the space incels.is, the largest dedicated incel web space, as well as stormfront.org, Stormfront being a very long-standing white supremacist web space. And I will be guiding you through this presentation by just basically giving you a lot of screenshot examples taken from our larger ethnographic data set, which I think kind of show you the patterns really well within these two distinct communities and how they decide on acceptance or exclusion. All right, so I think I can keep this slide very brief actually, because we had now 2.5 days of great conference presentations, which made us all aware of that the internet plays a role for radicalization processes. But just what I maybe want to point out is that web forums still remain an important node in the larger extremist ecosystem. And that is maybe a bit counterintuitive if you, if you ever looked at the Stormfront starting page, for example, it still looks like really like a website from the late 1990s or early 2000s. And if you then compare that to like a right-wing extremist TikTok edit, it just feels worlds apart. But these extremist web spaces, web forums actually have some advantages. So they do protect, for example, against deplatforming to a degree, and particularly important for our research, they allow the communities to kind of enforce their own norms. They allow self-moderation within the community. And that's why they're particularly interesting to look at for the gatekeeping processes. And maybe also something which I want to add at this point is that in these web forums, you often find a very committed core. For example, in the case of Stormfront, we know that there's around 40 users who have been active on Stormfront for more than 20 years. All right. I will quickly go over these two questions. Just basically, I'm not so much arguing for the general relevancy of gatekeeping in these spaces, but what I'm kind of arguing is that there's different patterns which communities use in different extremist spaces. And that's also why I brought in these two weird ancient Greek terms, which I will explain in a bit. And also we will be looking a bit at initial learning processes, because we noticed that actually you can't really separate gatekeeping from initial learning, because the tone and content and style of how a community gatekeeps will also directly impact the way a newcomer will initially learn within these spaces. All right. I think I already kind of told you the definition, but just maybe a comment on why is gatekeeping important. Well, I mean, some research points, I think it's also kind of intuitive to think that way, but some research points out that gatekeeping can actually be the transition from passive lurking on an extremist space to active participation, for example, in discussions or production of ideological content, can be an important step within a radicalization trajectory. And that's also why I would argue it's particularly important to look at gatekeeping processes within these spaces. All right, these are the two communities. I'm very familiar that many of you, I'm very sure that many of you are familiar with these spaces, or at least one of them. I think also they were actually reflected in a lot of the presentations we had in the last days, but just maybe a quick comment on why did we pick these two particular communities. For one, they do have different ideologies. So incels.is being very much associated with this extreme black-pilled misogyny. Stormfront, on the other hand, being, I would say, a very traditional stream of white supremacism, very much focused on preventing white genocide. And what's also kind of interesting is that they very much differ in user demographics, as research points out. And finally, what's interesting for us is they differ quite a bit in their architecture. So, for example, Stormfront, as you will see, has a very dedicated section in the forum where newcomers are supposed to introduce themselves, while incels rely a lot less on such structured elements. All right. So I told you I will be showing you a bunch of screenshots. Again, the content is at times quite vile, but I think they are kind of necessary to understand the larger patterns behind it. So here we actually see the first post of a newcomer. And on incels.is, like I said, you don't have a dedicated subsection of the forum where you would introduce yourself. You kind of just post to the general forum feed. And as you can see here, there's not an introduction, but the user just kind of picks up on like the general posting practice on incels.is, which is really often this type of very emotional, affective venting, kind of this rallying against the outgroup, and this own despair, basically. What I find interesting about this post is that the user in his first post already picks up on the incel lingo. So he already uses the term chat, for example, used to describe conventionally attractive men. But then what was interesting about this post, and why I'm showing it here, is that he commits a formal rule violation. I will not read out what exactly he said, but basically on incels.is, there's a very strict ban on any positive references to the LGBTQ community. And in the eyes of many community members, what he wrote was kind of not critical enough of that. So he was immediately, as you can see in the next comments, he was immediately attacked very harshly for that. These are just some examples. It was actually quite a long thread with many comments like that. And what I found particularly interesting, he was reported to the moderators. The moderators came in and banned his account. So he actually never posted again after this, and his introduction just kind of went wrong. And this, we found that to be one out of 4 criteria which we could identify in our larger data set, which kind of moderate hostility within these spaces. And I would argue that hostility is almost always present. So there's like very few examples where we observed where a newcomer was really received in a non-hostile way. But it is kind of moderated, like the amount of hostility is moderated by these 4 criteria. And users that don't align with these 4 criteria will receive a lot more hostility or might even get banned. All right, I will just show you examples for all of these. And I will kind of jump over the first one because I think I already just gave you an example for not complying with the formal posting rules. Of course, there's not only formal rules, though, there's also implicit norms of the community, which are, in this case, maybe particularly tricky because if you're a newcomer, you can actually go to the rules section of the forum, you can read up on the formal forum rules, but you can't do that with implicit norms. And what's quite interesting on incels.is is that technically a formal rule is that there's no direct calls for violence are not allowed. As you will see if you ever go in these spaces, though, is that there is a lot of direct calls for violence, particularly against women, but also against larger society, which is kind of blamed for incels situation. But what you won't see a lot is actually targeting of law enforcement. That is actually very uncommon in these spaces. And that user wrote like basically a longer post in which he kind of extended his violent fantasies also towards law enforcement. And the interesting thing is he was immediately spotted. He got very little engagement, actually. And the few comments he got were actually encoded language here. People posting this glowing emoji, which stands for glowy or glow in the dark. So they kind of like marked him as a potential federal infiltrator and never engaged with him again. And then the third point here is the subordination and community hierarchy. So incels generally have a very, I would maybe call it like 4chan-like way of engaging with each other. So even established members between each other can be very hostile, but new members are basically not allowed to engage in the same type of hostility towards established members. They kind of have to know their place, and if they do engage in said hostility, they are kind of reminded by established members to not do so. And finally, the criteria which we found, which actually was kind of like the only real way how we found that newcomers can kind of like reduce the amount of hostility a bit, was if they showed engagement with the black pill, so the underlying heart of incel ideology, this very strong genetic fatalism. And here in this case, a newcomer wrote actually a very long post where he kind of like compiled evolutionary biological findings and twisted them in a way so they kind of fit into the narrative, and he was received quite well. All right, just quickly going through these slides so we have some time for Stormfront. But what I want to kind of illustrate with this one is that hostility on InSys is also present between established members, but I kind of want to point out that it's not a constant. Like, yes, these spaces are extremely hostile, but my argument is that hostility is also used as a strategic tool. So we have, on the example on the left, we have a newcomer who does a very emotional type of venting post. He complains he might get thrown out of university because he threatened women. And he is received with open hostility. It's just one example out of many comments. And on the other side, we have a very much established user. Actually, during the point where we did this research, he was probably one of the most active posters in the community. And he actually kind of announced his potential suicide, and he received a lot of emotional support, showing that the space actually for some can also function as kind of a twisted emotional support space, and that hostility is selective. And largely, I kind of like, please direct your attention to like the little box on the right. I think that's really the most important thing here. These are statements taken from very influential community members, so from moderators or users with more than 25,000 posts. And what I kind of want to illustrate here with me, what I kind of want to illustrate with this box is that the community actively reflects on the purpose of the hostility. So they kind of actively use hostility, as one moderator says, I will not ban a post when a newcomer commits a rule violation. I will let it stand so others can attack the newcomer. You can kind of purge him, and then the post of the newcomer is kind of a symbol for others to not repeat the same behavior. Or another user said, he actually described it particularly as a defensive mechanism. He used the word ringer to kind of say, if we wouldn't do that, we would have even more infiltrators here. So we kind of use the strategy to protect against infiltration. All right. On Stormfront, things are quite different. Stormfront is very much structured compared to InSys. We have here, as you can see, this introduction thread, I would say, where there's not a technical, like there's no technical limit that prevents you from posting in other forum spaces, but you will have no credibility in the community. So you're kind of asked to introduce yourself in that space. And the screenshot on the right is just kind of to illustrate you, like, first of all, the architecture of Stormfront, but also that behind most of these subforums, you will actually find like pin threads or sticky threads, which will be specifically aimed towards newcomers to explain ideological basics or kind of like guide through the experience of using the website. All right, so jumping right into the initial selection thread. We saw here that Stormfront also employs gatekeeping, of course, but that it's comparatively more structured because it happens primarily in that thread. And it is based on two key criteria. One is racial suitability. So in this case, we observed a user claiming to be from Albania, who actually said he sympathizes a lot with the movement and wanted to join. He was immediately met with suspicion because of his background. He tried to convince the community by posting a picture of himself and proving his whiteness. However, he was denied he was not deemed white enough, and he was denied entrance. And on the other side, we have an example of ideological alignment. I mean, I would say that's a very broad criteria, of course, but that is kind of like the second key criteria. What I found interesting about this particular example, I've kind of blurred out the usernames, but it was actually a she, at least a self-claimed she, and she used the KKK in her username. And Stormfront still actually has some former or active KKK members. So she was already received because of that. She was received very positively for a lot of people pointing out how much they liked her username. Then she also appealed. She basically appealed to a lot of tropes which are circulated in the community. And she also said that she has been lurking for quite some time on the forum, kind of showing her dedication. And she was accepted with open arms. All right, with this example, I kind of just want to show you these, let's call them like initial study threads I mentioned. Like this is a thread titled National Socialism for Newcomers. And it's really a thread which is exactly compiled to give people who are coming into the space an idea, what are we talking about here? What is National Socialism from our perspective? And the thread itself is quite old. It's from 2016 originally, but it still gets quite a lot of engagement. In this case, we saw a newcomer basically just posting his approval, saying, hey, yeah, basically great article. I'm a neo-Nazi too, amazing. And interestingly enough, though, he received a correction because he actually violated some informal rules in the community. Community does not use the term Nazi, really. They prefer National Socialist. And therefore, he was met not with hostility, as you can see in strong contrast to Insys.is, but more with like a gentle correction, kind of saying, hey, we think that term is offensive, maybe use National Socialist. Yeah, and I thought that was a quite interesting difference. All right, and now these weird Greek terms kind of come into play, because our argument from this is, and here we kind of try to trace the journey in a very simplified manner from a typical newcomer coming basically from initial account registration to accepted community membership. And we argue that basically these two terms, paideia and agoge, kind of capture the essence of the two gatekeeping practices in these spaces. I will not talk too much about ancient Greece now, but just agoge basically is the very like the Spartan way of education focused on endurance and surviving. And it kind of felt it resembles this yeah, coming into the community in NCSIS, where you're just kind of made to endure the hostility. You have this gray cell status, so the rank of a gray cell, you are the lowest rank in the community. You will always be met with hostility until you reach 500 posts, and you kind of magically use this gray cell rank, and you are yeah, not an accepted core member of the community, but at least you are accepted in the community. And on Stormfront, on the other hand, I mean, of course, there's also an influence on like the Athenian counterpart, Paideia, which we think Stormfront kind of fits more into. Of course, still uses hostility to a degree, as you saw, for example, with those who are not selected. So the member who was, for example, left out because his whiteness was not deemed enough. But comparatively, you see a lot more structure. You kind of see, you see guidance, you see an emphasis on self-study, but actually established members who will kind of like almost gently correct ideological mistakes. And yeah, we felt it had yeah, much more similarities, little similarities with the agoge concept of INSYS. All right, so of course we also speculated how we could potentially explain these differences. So first of all, I'm not claiming that incels are never political or are not a political space or something, but compared to Stormfront, they do not have this unifying strict ideology with a clear political purpose in the end. And we actually think that Stormfront has, in a way, quite a lot of similarities with websites, with non-extremist websites, in that it basically just wants people who create an account to stay on the website, because it kind of needs people, obviously, to reach political goals. And incels primarily see their space as an emotional venting space. They kind of feel misunderstood by larger society, and they kind of deliberately go into that space to talk to like-minded people. So we suggest that they use this hostility as a deliberate defensive mechanism to yeah, protect against potential infiltration. Infiltration, by the way, means both against law enforcement, but also against like anti-community activists. So for example, there's a very active Reddit community called Incel Tears, which would go into the forum, take screenshots, post them on Reddit, and then kind of like mock the users there. Yeah, all right, that's kind of the argument here. And maybe what we can take away from this, I would say the biggest takeaway, also maybe reflecting a bit on the title of the conference, Signal or Noise, is that hostility hostility, I think, has been quite understood as a tool used against the out-group, of course, but hostility can also be used strategically towards the in-group. And I believe it's not always just shit posting or something, but as some of these moderator comments maybe illustrated to you, can have like a deeper sense of purpose to it. And finally, maybe the last comment, but of course, the intensity of gatekeeping in insta spaces could also potentially influence that people who are not allowed entrance-free spaces do not just automatically de-radicalize, but potentially are pushed towards more mainstream spaces and engage with insta spaces and more mainstream spaces such as TikTok. All right, thank you so much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you, Christopher. Next up, we have Ben, who's lost his sidekick for the afternoon, so he's going solo. We've got Ben Adams from the University of Adelaide, whose presentation is Blurred Lines, Mixed Ideologies, Far-Right Mainstreaming, and Best Practice Diversionary Approaches for Boys and Young Men. That's a seriously long title. Let's just put that out there. Yeah. Please welcome Ben.
All right, I'm doubling up here because I wanted to have a script to read from, so I would keep to time, because as has been mentioned, it is late in the afternoon, and I'm assuming that's why Garth has decided to leave early. No, he sends his apologies. Okay, so I'll just get straight into it. Today, what I want to do is bring together some data, but more so some conceptual insights from 3 different project strands that I've worked on during the last few years. The first 2 alongside Garth, and then the most recent one in my newer role at University of Adelaide. And I'm drawing on these 3 projects strands and bringing them together in order to highlight some of the commonalities or common insights that emerged across them all. So this will be a kind of condensed rolling snapshot of just a few things from each. The most important underlying point I want to make is to further emphasize and substantiate the ongoing links and blurred lines between extremism and the mainstream, not an unfamiliar topic, but in a few different ways, and connected to an expanded understanding of ideology in the context of mixed or incoherent or seemingly non-ideological extremist behaviors and violence. So the first strand involves research me and Garth did alongside others into PCVE practices and policy. First, in specific relation to schools and the use of restorative practice approaches and training for teachers and other educators under the umbrella of CVE funding. And this research involved discussions and interviews with Australian educators, principals, teachers, school counsellors, youth workers and others, along then with Australian PCVE practitioners, stakeholders, policymakers, and policy intermediaries. So the first points I want to make are from our paper on ideology, where we drew on a subset of data in which practitioners spoke about their views on ideology's role in driving violent extremism and efforts to counter it. And the headline takeaway from that data and this paper was that while ideology as it is generally defined in this field was not the sole or even primary driver of violent extremism, it does nevertheless matter for a variety of reasons, including the need to understand emergent trends and to understand the worldviews and life worlds of clients, and of which their particular ideological framework constitutes a significant part. However, a slightly more subtle point this paper touched on has to do with the definition or conceptualization of ideology that has dominated the PCVE field, and how a broader understanding of what ideology is or means might help us better perceive the connections between and context for seemingly incoherent or contradictory forms of ideological affiliation and extremism, along with their deeply embedded structural connections with the social, cultural or political mainstream. A couple of valuable contributions I should mention have been made since that paper was published. So Jacob Astley, for example, has labelled mixed forms of extremism, particularly esoteric variations that defy conventional ideological boundaries, as non-doctrinal forms. characterized by a fluid bricolage of attitudes, beliefs, and identity constructs which transcend existing policy-defined ideological categorizations, but are not therefore outside the realm of the concept of ideology per se. Or as Melagru, Hitchens, and Ayad argue, while many online idiosyncratic communities may appear mixed, unstable, or unclear, they are deeply rooted in ideological principles that predate their presence online. In citing this point, Astley observes that recognizing and addressing newly emerging and converging ideological currents, which often begin circulating in wider online ecosystems long before they are attributed as potentially causative to an act of extremist violence, presents a logical way forward. And similarly, Kohler notes that there have been only a very few attempts to move the discourse within terrorism and related studies beyond a binary and narrow framing of ideology as a doctrinal belief system. And terrorism research, he argues, has yet to discover the rich and valuable insights from political psychology and philosophy that have studied ideologies for many decades. So the other publication from this research I want to briefly touch on is this forthcoming chapter. And in many ways, this provides a summary of our research over this period, but channeled through the lens of acknowledging the links between status quo, patriarchy, hegemonic masculinity, and violent extremism, especially misogynistic extremism. And we expanded in this context on our observation that ideology, both in general conceptual terms and regarding the belief structures or guiding assumptions of particular individuals, is part of the waters in which we all swim and not easily distinguishable from various social, political, psychological, and material influences. Hegemonic masculinity, for example, is itself a key part of the dominant ideological context in which we all find ourselves and in which PCVE itself operates. Its ideological effects are felt not just amongst extremist movements or individual men, but throughout society, and can be reinscribed even unknowingly, within the field itself or by any of us. So next, I'll talk about a slightly more recent project Garth and I worked on together, which was the Extremism Diversion Program Review. And this ended up being quite a long report, so I'm not going to cover it all, but I want to highlight a few points here related to both digital spaces and the connections between extreme and the mainstream, especially. First, in this report, we emphasize the importance of various critiques and potential problems associated with the concept and language of radicalization, which speak back to issues of how extremism connects with the wider mainstream world. So we see here, talked about through Ravel, referring back to Sedgwick, that the emphasis on the idea of radicalization transfers questions of causality onto individuals and significantly de-emphasizes the wider circumstances or root causes. We did look at the role of digital literacy, e-safety, and digital off-roading, and arguing that while such approaches are a vitally important part of the picture, they also require attention to the caveat expressed here by Wallner, that, for example, grievances voiced by extremists on structural inequality, poverty, injustice, marginalization, and discrimination are often real, making ideas of overcoming these injustices through violence, as advocated by violent extremists, a legitimate argument even for rational and educated individuals in some situations. And what that points to, again, are the limitations of attempting to address certain drivers of extremist violence without reflecting on the structural conditions that produce such particular identities and behaviours. That's just a bit more from the report, but for time, I'm going to move ahead. Finally, I want to talk about the project I'm currently working on, exploring digital pathways to violent extremism in young Australians. And I'll briefly highlight some of the preliminary qualitative data that we're looking at, and then try to finish by re-emphasising those through lines of ideologies as the waters we all swim in, and the connection between extremism, including extremist violence, and the mainstream of social, political, and cultural norms. Okay, so this project involves several different elements. My roles as a postdoctoral researcher, hold on, skipping ahead. And I'm working particularly with Dr. Nathan Manning on the more qualitative aspects of the project. including interviews with Australian adolescents about their social media experiences, what kinds of content they are encountering, how they feel about it, and how they respond, along with social media mapping and thematic content analysis of Australian far-right, misogynist, and associated social media influencers and content creators. So as I said, this data is still very preliminary. In terms of interviews, we've spoken to about 20 adolescents so far out of an initial aim to speak with 50. This first round has been a broader convenience sample, so not targeting individuals who've been flagged as radicalizing to violent extremism or engaging with extremist content per se. And so the results and discussions we've had so far have been, more reflective of a relatively tame, normative, and even in some cases positively protected youth experience online and with social media. But in the next stage of the project, we plan and hope to speak with a more targeted cohort of youth, specifically identified as having engaged more enthusiastically or being at risk of engaging with explicitly extremist or violent material. But some important insights have emerged even already from our more normie interviewees. So from our first round of interviews, what I want to highlight is the almost, and this is not new to anyone in this room, but the almost constant recurrence of responses that frame a variety of content as just a joke, which, if not explicitly violent or formally extremist, is at the very least ideologically problematic in terms of referencing various mundane forms of casual bigotry, prejudice, and stereotyping. This slide here I wanted to keep in because it was sort of an interesting one, and I thought back to Emily Thompson's presentation on sandbox experiences and VR games in terms of Minecraft and Roblox, which I think was yesterday or whenever it was. But so I won't go into detail about that. Basically, a kid got concerned that his friends were building Nazi camps in Minecraft. Some of the youth we spoke with identified the relatively common presence of such content and told us that, in their view, it was being posted or interpreted as just a joke by others, but said that they themselves didn't like or were opposed to it. And some gave a more ambiguous sense of their own attitudes towards such mundane but ubiquitously stereotyping or prejudicial content. One 14-year-old boy, for example, seemed to discuss it in neutral terms. And sorry, I think I've just lost my order of slides here. There we go. Okay. No, maybe there it is. Okay. So one 14-year-old boy, for example, seemed to discuss it in neutral terms, but notably described the relatability of common, to the point of cliche, jokes and tropes, especially sexist ones, such as women should be in the kitchen. Others were more admittedly entertained or engaged with such content and defensive of it themselves as being just a joke. And notably in both this case and others, we see references to content relying on gendered stereotypes, prejudice being seen as more acceptable than racialized prejudice or racist jokes. Although in at least one case here, that was partly explained by the fact of the boys' school being a diverse majority non-white environment. So he himself was non-white and was talking about, he didn't take this racial stuff seriously, but his classmates did, but no one took the gendered stuff seriously. And that's just anecdotal, but yeah, in this boy's view, it was both boys and girls who were commonly seeing this gendered content as just a joke. And of course, there are a variety of reasons why that could be the case, like social pressure on girls to, not be feminist killjoys and that sort of thing. So as to how they actually feel about it is, of course, open to interpretation. But I think it's notable that this kind of ubiquity and apparently wider or broader acceptability of mundane sexism and misogynist tropes is notable. So the content these adolescents spoke with us about encountering, is varied. Relatively few so far mentioning graphic or explicitly threatened violence, although this girl is one example who said that she knew that her friends had been sent, gore content, for example, though she said that she hadn't been herself. But they're referencing forms of casual bigotry, prejudice, or stereotyping that, don't meet common definitions of extremist or let alone illegal or prescribed material. But as we've heard a lot about over the last few days, those seemingly mundane or widespread expressions of misogyny, for example, shouldn't be seen as disconnected from the broader spectrum or ecosystem of far-right or misogynist extremism and potential violence. So this is just a sort of snapshot of an earlier snapshot of where we're going with this social media stuff. I'll just sort of briefly put that up there because I'm aware of time. Electric manosphere, a little boogaloo reference for you there. Okay, in terms of social media, I've got 3 examples here from publicly accessible and public-facing influencer or actively political accounts. And again, the point here is not that the content is illegal or even explicitly violent, but rather that it speaks to the kinds of ideological assumptions and messaging that circulates within these spaces, and is then being absorbed, shared, and engaged with, by followers in ways that are part of the mainstreaming ideological spectrum, that then can feed into, extremist violence and indeed violence of many kinds. And this is, again, the concept of e-extremism. I won't rest on that because I don't have time, but it is a very useful concept I've found in pursuing what we're doing. Okay, so I've put all of these up here, but hopefully you can just follow along with the brief bits I'll highlight in the time I have left. The first example here is Dark Angel is very much in the manosphere category. He generally posts content about women and relationships, all rooted in traditionally gender essentialist tropes or assumptions. This example is a post he made in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, but it nevertheless gives a sense of his more general concerns because, of course, this is what he focuses on in relation to Kirk. That is Kirk's opposition to gay marriage, to abortion, to transgender identity, and so on. A few things I'd highlight are the way he connects these gender-based ideological concerns and political agendas with a more generalized, libertarian-coded and mainstream idea that, people these days can't speak to their opinions for fear of being cancelled or, in Kirk's case, murdered. So the argument goes, the masculine mindset he describes Kirk as having is one that, he defines in terms of a fairly predictable and familiar cliches from the relative mainstream of social discourse, such as opposition to gay marriage, couched in the, the rhyming mantra of Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And interestingly, he also arguably co-opts an element of what he himself might call woke sort of language in his reference to the world today being evil and toxic. One small example of a broader trend whereby the far right and the manosphere often utilize inverted versions of sort of more progressive or feminist language for their own purposes. In this case, we see the implicit points logic. It's not masculinity that is toxic, but the world that rejects a properly religiously inspired, moral and masculine mindset. And indeed, we're in the realm here of appealing to the mainstream or mainstream adjacent ideological inclinations, and what Aegis and others have called the masculinism of a culturally widespread anti-gender sentiment or socio-political agenda. We also see here an example of how the white supremacist extreme can seek to draw more moderate or mainstream conservative and libertarian viewers toward their agenda through intellectualized argument. Conservative man, you either join us and get railed on, or don't join us and still get railed on. And this connects back to the slow red pilling that Mario was talking about this morning in relation to the NSN, I noticed. And additionally, we see how the broader Australian right-wing and manosphere ecosystem can sort of work to propagate and reinforce itself, despite internal differences, or in fact because of them, where white supremacists argue that Charlie Kirk was in fact a moderate, egalitarian because he didn't believe in biological racism, which can then help to make influences or perspectives which fall short of that extreme seem more reasonable. Or others may be convinced of the limitations and internal contradictions of those positions by such intellectualized far-right rhetoric. And also, and I assume this will be a familiar face here, but sort of seeing how the far right can leverage humor, and again, not an unfamiliar point, but leverage humor and sort of relatable health, fitness or lifestyle content to broaden their appeal. Tapping into existing and not directly political social media trends, like here, lamenting cheaply made plastic salt grinders and microplastics in our food, combined with a biologically deterministic homophobia that, you know, is reminiscent of Alec Jones ranting about, you know, fluoride in the water turning the frogs gay. But even here, I would also point out with Cottrell, you know, are we meant to think he's being serious from in his logic about that, or is that just a joke to sort of carry a broader homophobia? Does he really think that the microplastics are turning us gay? That kind of thing. Okay, so just to finish off, broadly what this all suggests, I think, is the need for continuing to expand a more complex, reflective approach within PCVE and diversionary approaches that recognises a dialectical relationship between the status quo and its seemingly extremist fringe. This is particularly relevant in regard to seemingly mixed ideologies and mainstreaming in digital spaces because of the technological affordances they give for an ever more widely spread and interrelated circulation of content, and more importantly, ideas and normalised assumptions, which we know can feed into violence at their extremist ends. Given that gender remains such a powerfully widespread axis of ideological prejudice and structural power inequality, sort of in a global sense, in a widespread sense, this is particularly the case when it comes to considerations of hegemonic masculinity and misogynistically inflected extremism. As Gentry has put it, manifestations of anti-gender sentiment and violence represent a broader underlying, quote, ontology and epistemology that power belongs to the dominant, or in other words, an ideology of hierarchical domination. Thank you.
All right. Last but certainly not least, from the Government of South Australia is Emma Gerhardy, whose presentation is titled When the News Becomes Noise, Examining Distortion in Online Media Framing on Perception of Terrorism in Australia. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. One more presentation to get through, so please just bear with me. Hopefully it's not too boring for everyone. Hello, my name is Emma, as we said earlier, from Government of South Australia. So I work for South Australia's Countering Violent Extremism program, which is the inclusion support program located in the Department of Human Services. Because I like to keep busy, I also did my honours degree in criminology this year, and I'll be talking about my thesis, which I submitted recently for this presentation. So I want to start by asking a question. So does everyone in this room remember where they were or what they were doing when 9/11 happened? Raise of hands or whatever. Charlotte doesn't have her hand up because she wasn't born yet. We had a joke about that in our class. So that's why we joke about that. But I remember where I was. I was actually waiting for my 7th birthday to start. I was born on September 11, fun fact. And it was just this weird picture of like me getting ready for my party, the party bags, balloons and stuff in the background. And then the TV was just swamped with this like horrific news coverage. It was just rolling footage of the planes going through the towers of smoke, the victims. It was just this real powerful dynamic. And that's essentially the power of media. It doesn't just show certain events, it cements them into our collective memory. And I just want to say that it cements certain events in our memory because some forms of violence become a national movement, national remembrance, but other harms, like domestic violence, never actually do. There are no constant replays, there's no shared pause, and no kind of collective shock. And I explored this in my honours thesis, which was titled Who Security Really Counts? Canonising Terrorism, Silencing Domestic Violence in Australian Media. And that research compared how Australia represented those two types of horrific violences, the terrorism and the domestic violence, between 2014 and 2024. And I really wanted to see how they presented those two forms of violence and how they were different and what that means for our national security agenda. Next one. So I guess I'm kind of alluding to a hierarchy of importance of violence. And that matters for terrorism research because it exposes a blind spot at the centre of national security. We respond to terrorism with urgency, resources, and that real collective focus. Domestic violence, despite its scale and its severity, is treated as a private, routine, and kind of manageable issue. But echoing what Cynthia spoke about during her keynote on day one, which feels like a long time ago now, but she spoke about misogyny, violent misogyny, and that gender-based violence being kind of like that glue that kind of meshes with violent extremism, can kind of almost be that precursor and maybe that sign, that signal that we missed when, you know, looking at these perpetrators. So that's essentially why I chose this area, to question this hierarchy that decides which violence counts as security and which violence is allowed to remain ordinary. Because I guess it seems like we're treating terrorism as that earthquake and domestic violence as that kind of background tremor, yet the same fault line runs beneath the both of them. This is just a bit of a slide to show how my research is filling the gap. Won't go too much into it, but we've kind of got a focus on traditional framing of terrorism research, traditional framing of domestic violence research, and then I'm trying to kind of bridge that gap. There is some research out there, but not a lot about comparing these two. So I started with a literature review, and there were 4 themes that kind of came across the literature of domestic violence and terrorism. So the first, talking about sensationalism and urgency. And so for terrorism, it was very, urgent. It's on the screen, like I spoke about before in the 9/11 events. It's just constantly replaying on the screen. And it's really amplified as this threat that we all need to be thinking about. Whereas kind of the opposite for DV, where it's quite individualized and it's very episodic framing. So just talking about these incidents here and there, but not kind of talking about them as a collective issue. Then we have the international focus. So that's where the literature shows that terrorism is really thought about in that international concept, where no matter what happens overseas, if there are attacks overseas, we are really thinking about what it means for Australia and how we're kind of protecting ourselves. However, there's not really a international focus on DV, so we're not thinking about incidents that happen overseas about domestic violence and what that means for us here. Then we have selective labelling. So with selective labelling in the terrorism context, the research talks about, who we're calling a terrorist, and media kind of like shaping that identity of who we think of a terrorist and who is called a terrorist, and also what that means for who that person represents, so their community. That kind of increases the us versus them mentality in reporting. So there was a study by Beatus et al. In 2021, and their research demonstrated that attacks by Muslims in the United States were 5 times more likely to be described as a terrorism, and that's even when controlling for fatalities, group affiliation, and mental illness. And the last one I'll talk about is state and security voices. So in that, what the research talks about in that sense is that in media reporting, state actors, so police, security, intelligence, they're really seen as the authorities in the terrorism space, not so much the victims in that community of the terrorist attacks, where it's pretty much the opposite to domestic violence. So, we talk about victims, but not essentially their story, kind of just talking about them in those episodes of violence. And we're not really hearing much about the state, law enforcement, all that kind of stuff to kind of elevate as that threat. So my research was guided by 2 theoretical frameworks, and it's important to note that I needed both of them to really highlight the gaps of each framework. So we started with securitization theory. So I used the definition by the Copenhagen School, and that explains how an issue becomes a security threat. And it's not necessarily because it's the most dangerous, but it's because about the powerful actors framing it as urgent or existential. And then I also utilized feminist security. So that offers a different lens. And that theoretical framework asks questions about like whose security counts and whose experiences are erased from that security talk. And operationalize these theories using kind of that security language and then looking at the feminist security principles. And they were coded through linguistic and thematic indicators in the media articles. And yeah, so slipped ahead too far. But essentially, those two theoretical frameworks are working out how we perceive those two forms of violence. So what did I think was going to happen? So essentially, I used comparative lenses for the hypotheses, and they were just opposites of each other. So I thought that terrorism would be collectivized, reported in those sensational forms, and it's really amplified, whereas it's the opposite for domestic violence, quite individualistic reporting, and they're kind of framed as those private conflicts, not a kind of a national threat to be managed. Then it's about the media framing. So it was hypothesized that terrorism would be framed thematically. So really looking at that broader picture of why terrorism might be happening and whatnot, compared to episodic framing of domestic violence. So just those kind of incidences we're reporting on. And then there was a hypothesis about institutional responses and urgency. So as you can kind of guess from my presentation so far, it was hypothesized that terrorism would have that really strong state response, coordinated urgency, and it would be somewhat the opposite for domestic violence. So it's kind of depicted as quite fragmented, under-resourced, and lacking that urgency. So how I did this, so I collected 331 articles from 2014 to 2024. 150 of those were terrorism articles and 181 were domestic violence articles. We kept two media platforms like ABC, SBS, The Guardian, and kind of didn't include any of those think tank commentaries because we kind of just wanted that mainstream news, what people are reading. We use search terms, and I guess one of the limitations of the study is these search terms aren't going to collect all that information. We see how media report certain incidences, so they don't always traditionally say domestic violence, terrorism in those articles. So that's a consideration for future research. But once we had those articles, we used in vivo open thematic coding, so we could kind of see those themes coming naturally. And they were cross-checked with a second researcher to kind of strengthen the rigor of the study. And another limitation that I'll touch on, as I guess it's not empirical research, we're not actually measuring how people are perceiving these articles. It's more, let's look at the articles, let's see what the themes are in them. So some results. So I've split the results up into the terrorism and the DV. So as you can see, the beautiful coloured picture is our hierarchy chart. So a lot going on in the space. There were 37 main themes, which are like those big block of colours. And then we've got 431 sub-themes, which are those little boxes in the boxes. And as you can see, have a read, those are the top 10 codes overall for terrorism. So international context was the top coded code. And then this is what we had for, I didn't change the heading of that, get rid of terrorism, top DV codes. So again, hierarchy chart showing those codes. And we had 31 main themes for DV and 340 sub-themes. And they're the top codes. So women victims, assumed women victims were the top code. And overall, these findings did support the hypotheses, which we talked about before. So terrorism was consistently framed as urgent, state-centric, and highly securitized by those results. And DV was individualized, reported as private misfortune, lacking those kind of state narratives, failing to raise it as a collective security crisis. So looking at those results, there were 4 themes overall that I talked about in my thesis. First one we'll talk about is called the canonization of terrorism and the silencing of domestic violence, the heading of my thesis. So essentially the results are showing us that the way media portrays terrorism, it really canonizes it into our memory, kind of lodges it from that repetition, that ritualized remembrance. It doesn't necessarily just inform us of what happens. It really inhabits our minds and makes us remember it, which is kind of the opposite of DV incidences. So September 11 was coded 91 times. And I just thought that was interesting because after September 11 in Australia, there were approximately 82 anti-terrorism laws enacted. And that equated to approximately 1 law every 6 to 7 weeks. And you kind of compare that to DV, which wasn't actually coded in the international context once in any of the media articles. And I guess we're still struggling to get coercive control over the line. So you just look at that dissonance there. And there's one article quote, which I thought was quite powerful. They said, Australia is a long way from New York and Washington, D.C., but the September 11 terror attacks had a profound impact on our country, which I think summarises it quite nicely. That one. So the next theme I'll talk about is a politics of perspective. So media shapes not just what we think about radicalisation and terrorism, but how we see it. And that's where the politics of perspective comes in. So terrorism and radicalisation were reported as kind of this fast, dramatic, like coverage. Like there were quotes about like inhabiting your mind, like going down the rabbit hole of hate. Like it really posed as this thing that happens quickly and like you're never going to escape it. If you read something about terrorism, you're going to like become a terrorist kind of thing. It's quite overpowering. And that kind of raises the question when you look at it. Like, does that framing eclipse the slower drivers of terrorism and violent extremism? Things like misogyny, racism, inequality, isolation, and that very much contributes to the conditions of radicalisation and terrorism. But there was also a deep parallel that was found in this. So radicalisation essentially reshapes perspective, narrows a person's worldview, kind of displaces that independent judgment. And that mirrors Evan Stark's concept of perspecticide in the concept of domestic violence, where coercive control also slowly replaces a victim's sense of reality. The media reporting reflects this overlap in both DV and terrorism stories. People are described as like losing themselves or having their perspective rewritten. And yeah, it was the same kind of in that DV reporting where coercive control was starting to be talked about a bit more. Next one. So marginalisation of voices. So in terrorism and domestic violence, what wasn't reported kind of revealed just as much as what was. So in terrorism coverage, there was an uneven representation in types of violence. So Islamic State and Al-Qaeda were mentioned 99 times, right-wing extremism 84 times, incel violence only 4 times. So I guess there's not a huge discrepancy between the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda and right-wing, but there is a discrepancy in the incel. And it still kind of suggests there could be a heavy focus on those specific threats. Minorities, so Islamophobia was only mentioned 5 times, whereas anti-Semitism was mentioned 38 times. So, you know, talking about that uneven attention to victimization. First Nations people, almost absent. There was only one article about truth-telling curricula, and that speaks to what we perceive about the ongoing harms of colonisation, which is often described as terror from those lived experiences. And we did have a similar hierarchy in DV reporting. So out of the 433 DV victims, so just collectively DV victim being mentioned, the women were mentioned 310 times, Indigenous women only 16 times, and LGBTQIA+ only 5 times. And that mirrors Piper et al.'s argument in 2019 that white women are framed as that ideal victim, while women of colour, LGBTQIA+ communities, migrant women, and sex workers were often framed as responsible for their own harm. The last theme is authorship and the politics of narration. So it's kind of opposite in authorship. So in terrorism, 94 of the 150 articles, or about 63%, were written by men. And in DV, 73% were written by women. So women are kind of writing about those social issues, whereas men are kind of pushed to writing those security issues. And that kind of echoes that long-standing news divide about security and social writing. And it's reflecting what feminist security scholars describe as the masculinization of security. A discourse where protection and authority are performed through militarized state-centric language. And in this logic, safety is delivered through control and security becomes synonymous with masculine power. I'll just go over this quickly because I've got my warning about 2 minutes. So I guess with policy recommendations, because I've kind of got that practitioner and that academic lens, I think practitioners sometimes struggle with recommendations from academia where we need in our language as practitioners. So I've kind of just tried to give a few ideas about how we can kind of break down that fragmentation to, I guess, echoing Marianne Hester's 3-planet model, if you're familiar with that concept, where there's like social services, law enforcement, and in this incidents, it'll be media. They're kind of operating on their own planet and they're not aligning. So you're never going to get the best result unless those planets align. So just have it up on the screen, some of those recommendations. So mainstream news plays a powerful role in shaping how we understand terrorism and, by extension, what we treat as a national threat. When terrorism is positioned as a benchmark of danger, other harms like domestic violence, misogyny, and colonisation slip out of view. They're framed as private problems, not public crises. And media doesn't just report violence, it orders it. It decides which harms feel urgent, which feel distant, and which never enter our national imagination at all. Media just doesn't report violence, it orders it. I think I said that already, disregard. And in a world where information moves faster than reflection, those hierarchies don't just shape headlines, they shape policy, priorities, and ultimately who security counts. Thank you.
Right. We are almost there. Thank you to you three for your thought-provoking presentations, but for your deep insights and contributions to the field. So a lot more people left than we predicted. So that should mean questions. Yeah. The odds weren't good at the TAB this afternoon, but there are bodies in the room. So we've got 10, 12 minutes where we might be able to stretch this conversation out. Does anyone want to set us on our way? Let's go.
Thank you all so much for those presentations. Mine's for Christopher. Obviously, having spent many years of my life on incel forums, I was pleased to see you kind of refer to them at that kind of venting space and kind of shouting into the void somewhat. I was interested whether or not you'd seen any like shifts in those gatekeeping practices, because when I spent time on those forums, the kind of accepted behaviours often changed and shifted, and there were lots of points of disagreement, whether it was whether violence is actually something that's supported or those kind of things. So yeah, in kind of more recent studies that you've done, have you seen much of a sort of shift in what's acceptable behaviour and what's not?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question and the kind words. So I basically did the like 2 batches. One time I was in this space in 2023 for another project, and then this research was primarily compiled in late 2024 and early 2025. And I would say maybe not so much that I would identify distinct like gatekeeping differences, but for example, I noticed quite a lot of differences in general hostility. I remember that when I got back into the space in 2025, it actually really took me, like it kind of hit me again really, because I felt like the amount of general hostility had increased a lot. And I felt that also really translated to the newcomers. So I'm not claiming in 2023 they had been treated nicely, but I still at least saw people coming into the space and, for example, you know, not saying something which does not align 100% with incel ideology, and then another incel would kind of send them like a link or write like a long explanation of this is the blue pill, this is the black pill. What you said is very blue pilled. We don't want that here. And compare that to 2025, there was a lot less of that behavior. I feel like I would maybe call it almost like a siege mentality. Really, the community has kind of developed where there, and I would really see it's primarily, yes, law enforcement, but I see also really the incel tears community on Reddit is kind of seen as this primary antagonist, constantly lurking on incel spaces, and I think that has kind of led to this spiral of hostility increasing further. Thank you.
Anyone else? Fiona? While that mic's making its way over, question for you, Christopher. We often see, and I think a lot of us in practice have seen cases of youth being turned away from groups because they're too loud, too loose, too boisterous, too dysregulated. Are there any trends in the work you've done online to suggest the same types of things are happening on those forums, or are you able to identify when youth are present on those forums through any of those slightly adolescent chaotic behaviors?
So I mean, it's not like we cannot identify the age of like an individual user, and the problem is also as like they don't generally introduce themselves on these spaces. But we know from research, obviously, that there's quite a lot of very young users in these spaces. And I mean, I both think it's kind of the hostility on the one hand could be a potential chance to also for de-radicalization efforts to kind of get into, because, you know, we have people probably searching for an answer for their struggles, kind of, you know, this reframing of their own dating problems as like a larger struggle of unattractive men in society. They kind of look for the answers. They are pushed away from that space. And obviously that could be a good point to potentially approach them when they are kind of maybe open to receive different comments. On the other hand, and that's also what I said during the presentation, it's of course also a potential danger that they will not de-radicalize, but instead just kind of take their views to TikTok, where there is enough manosphere content to be found as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Fiona.
I think so. Yep. Great. So my question is for Emma. I think in the CVE space at the moment, there's this new opportunity with Step Together becoming public, and this more public awareness, or we're trying to boost public awareness about CVE. But a lot of that focus is on young men, given what the cohorts are. And I think with the mixed, unclear, unstable ideologies or right wing really being in the news at the moment, that's also a focus on young white boys, realistically, and trying to protect them. So, which is valuable, but do you have any advice or thoughts on how do we do that messaging correctly and balance it at a time when so many different areas are trying to get the eyes of educators and young people and parents and carers and everything? How do we contextualize our work within that space appropriately to make sure that we're not shoving out all of these other things just so we can get eyes on us to protect a cohort that, as you've said, media has constructed in this way as well?
Lovely question and very good question. The gold question, isn't it? I think it's a difficult thing to manage, but some of the recommendations I put in the research were about collaboration. So I think it can't just be one agency running it, especially not the media companies necessarily running it themselves. So one of the recommendations were to actually speak to the people involved in these communities, speak to the marginalized voices, raise those voices in the reporting. And I guess it opens up the question of where the CVE space goes and what other resources we can bring in. Not sure if I'm allowed to talk about Cove. Can I talk about Cove? Just getting my manager's approval.
Just do it, Emma.
Yeah, just do it. So I guess like in the CVE space, we're seeing like that rise in Cove participants, so the coercive online violent extremism or sadistic online exploitation. There's different ways to word it. And we're kind of in that space of, well, it's not, I know ideological motivation is kind of what we've been speaking about, but it's not ideologically driven. But, you know, if someone calls in a bomb threat, I don't think the parents of kids in that school care if they're a victim of coercion. They still called in a bomb threat, and that's, you know, it has those consequences. But it's not the most appropriate program for them to be in, a CVE program. So we're kind of looking at a different way to manage these clients using the KIND program, which I'm not sure if people know about, but it's kind of like a therapeutic program which talks about family violence and kind of that interpersonal violence. So kind of about being creative about where we can draw in these other resources to approach this really complex world we're in, where one sort of messaging, one sort of media reporting isn't going to attract everyone and kind of paint that perspective, if that answers your question.
One more down the front, really. A few minutes.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I have a question to Emma as well. If I understood your presentation correctly, you were focusing on the far right and the Islamistic scene, but I have a question regarding the role of the media defining extremism and terrorism with regard to the far left. Because in Germany, we quite often have the situation where I would say media, politicians, individuals would argue they are fighting for the right cause, but with the wrong tools. And if some police officers get hurt, it's an oopsie doopsie. But what can we do? They are pretty much the good guys. How do you see that?
Oh, we've got some good questions, don't we? I think, yeah, in the coding process, it was quite difficult because the journalists are saying far right, but are we talking about this one? Are we talking about this one? And it was kind of hard to kind of conceptualize what each, group or ideology was. So I guess it was captured in an overarching theme and kind of had these different sub themes. So I guess, if you look at the hierarchy chart, there's different kind of codes in there, and it was kind of just about, presenting that. But I guess in the mainstream media articles I looked through, there wasn't much about left-wing extremism, and that's maybe an issue in reporting as well. But it wasn't something that I necessarily kind of dove into in the research, but thank you.
A left-wing extremists need to sort this shit out. There's a gap in the conversation. This will be a big question.
I don't even know if it's a question, Steve. It's actually more of, I don't know if it's a comment or if it's an FYI. And all three presentations were great, thank you, but also covering quite different areas. So I don't know where I'm going to direct my question, but I will direct it to Emma, because I think it nicely bookended the conference with the keynote address, and everything as well. And it was really just an FYI, but recently we've got I'm from New South Wales government, and we've got a new police commissioner that's come on board, and he's made some public media statements about domestic violence and about cracking down on perpetrators of domestic violence in the same way that we treat serious organised crime and terrorism threats. That's the language that he's been using. So almost a very masculine response to cracking down on, a security response to cracking down on perpetrators. And you can take that however you want to take that. But what we also know is that, New South Wales has got, I think, one of the largest per capita police forces in the world, I think. I think we're up there. What we also know is, despite that kind of media statement, actually about 80% of New South Wales police resources go into fighting domestic violence issues. Far more than goes into counter-terrorism. Far more resources go into it. So it doesn't get the media attention, I agree, but it does get the resourcing and the time and the resources. And as someone who's worked in the countering violent extremism space for a very long time, particularly in the community engagement space around building trust around the work we do in CVE, that's been an argument from the communities for decades now, is that why are you talking about CVE? There's much more important issues like domestic violence. And undoubtedly that's true, but some of the kind of FAQs that we would have to put out, and you talk about step together messaging and things like that too, was to say, actually, government puts far more funding into fighting domestic violence than it does into CVE. But that doesn't get, you probably don't know that because it's not getting the media coverage or the messaging through those. So it's more of a comment, I guess.
Probably not a bad place to end things, Malcolm, with more questions than answers. Hoping you guys can join us in sending a big thank you to our three amazing panel this afternoon. And thanks to you all for writing.